Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Discover Wellbeing Podcast. I'm your host, Allison Adams, a holistic health and leadership coach and consultant, helping you thrive in all areas of your life. Today, my guest is Bud Wilson. He's a leadership development trainer, wilderness guide, and founder of Deep Nature Journeys. With decades of experience in awareness training and nature-based leadership, Bud passionately advocates for ecological, social, and personal renewal. As a former senior leader at the John Denver's Windstar Foundation, where he collaborated with thought leaders like John Denver, Buckminster Fuller, and many more, he learned that true success in business and communities begins with caring for well-being of the whole. Today, he helps individuals and organizations align with nature and purpose, fostering transformative, sustainable, and impactful leadership. I look forward to having you meet my guest, Bud Wilson. Bud, welcome to the Discover Wellbeing Podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation about something so meaningful to both of us, how to cultivate resilient leadership with nature as our framework.
It's really my pleasure, and it's an honor to be asked. So thank you.
Could we start by having you define your definition of well-being?
Sure. First of all, I love the concept of being rather than doing, although obviously human beings are very active and engaged in doing a lot, sometimes too much. But I think that concept of well-being, it really encompasses wholeness, mind, body, and spirit. And when we are living in balance and harmony with all that is, even not only oneself, but others, and all of the life force energy that is more than human, that would be my broadest definition of well-being, is to have a degree of reverence, presence, humility, and really engaged in the practice of deep listening enhances one's capacity for well-being and one's capacity to be of service to others. So I think that would be probably my most comprehensive overview of what it is to be well.
And it speaks on many levels, the work that you do, but knowing you personally, having moved to Boulder, Colorado some years ago, and we met in it was personal and it was professional, our work with Theory U and developing a relationship where we get to see that there is no separation, who we are at the essence of, or at our essence rather, of what and how we want to show up in full presence, and then holding that space for others to see what can emerge. I know that we're going to be exploring many pathways in this conversation of how you've done that. So I appreciate
I'm glad you brought in the idea of separation, because the core ecological principle of interdependence and interconnectedness is so often dismissed by our modern world. And so I've often mentioned that if we have an attitude or a perception of separation combined with an attitude of superiority to all other forms of life, the combination of those two factors really explains why we are in the predicament that we're in as a species.
Yes, relating to everything.
Yeah.
And how we can feel either that sense of oneness and opportunity versus fragmentation and fear.
And it's really ironic because most human beings long to belong, and yet we have this perception of separation. So it's really a paradoxical challenge to cut through that.
Oh, so good. So good. I'd love for everyone to know, I just mentioned that you and I have known each other for a few years now, but if you're able to just briefly share, I read that you went to Harvard and that you were an activist. You were an athlete and an activist. I don't know if that is typical for Harvard undergrad students to belong to both worlds, because athletes they do everything with passion, but also that element of competitiveness And then you have the social activist who is passionate, but has just a broader holding of what's to be accomplished, if you will. So do you want to share how that influenced your views at such a young age?
It's always challenging to keep it brief, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
And I'm glad that you made the distinction that I was an undergrad in the Harvard College, because immediately when people hear Harvard, they often associate it either with the Harvard Law School or with the Harvard Business School. And back then, in what I call the tumultuous era 100 years ago, during the Vietnam War, it the folks across the river at the business school were considered the enemy, and the establishment, right? So this harkens back to the older crowd that may be listening. But for young people, it's helpful, I think, to understand that, that with all the divisiveness and divisiveness now in our culture, back then, the harshest it got was America, love it or leave it bumper stickers. And those of us in the activist movement were really wanting to be understood for America, make it better, and really live up to our dream. So I think that the short answer to your question is that those tumultuous times forced all of us, no matter where we came from, to have a really core grounding in our values and our principles. You could practically not even get across campus without engaging in an argument about whether you were for or against our involvement in Southeast Asia. Back then, Henry Kissinger was on the visiting faculty member, and there were protests to kick him off campus because of his authoritarian worldview of controlling everything. So it was just a very heady time. And I had been recruited both as I was Boys League president, I was a National Football Foundation Hall of Fame scholar athlete, and as a running back. And so I had a lot of attention poured on me. And when you're 18, it can be overwhelming. I had football, it's hard to believe, but I was fast enough to not have too many hardcore collisions with the big, mean middle linebackers that didn't want me to score any more touchdowns. But in high school, I played in front of 75,000 people in the Los Angeles Coliseum in an all-star game, Southern California all athletes against Northern California. And so I showed up and also in track as a sprinter. And I think the distinction was that I was able to bridge worlds. And I think that athletes often have a gift of being able to communicate across differences. But my first assignment in my expository writing class was and this is really going to date me, the professor wrote on a blackboard in white chalk, competition is bad for the soul. Discuss. Now, this was very disruptive to my understanding of competition. And of course, I went to public high school, so I didn't have the advantage of having been at prep school to understand that the professor was really just wanting to have us define our terms. But I took it personally. What do you mean it's going to bad for my soul to be competitive? But boy, I'll tell you what, that obviously that assignment has stayed with me all these decades later to ponder and to consider how we compete and what elements are supportive of healthy competition. And just having a deep inquiry into that question alone shifts people, because immediately we're so conditioned to believe that competition, survival of the fittest, which by the way was a false claim taken out of Darwin's research. And he passed away on his way to do a clarification of the way that survival of the fittest was used to justify manifest destiny for the British Empire. And in fact, Spencer distorted it because actual definition was that the species that survive are the most collaborative and cooperative. And it's not the most cunning, sharpest teeth, biggest muscles. That was a complete distortion by a guy named Spencer of Darwin's actual message to humanity about evolution and competition. So survival of the fittest, if we can just reframe that alone in our culture to be the most collaborative, most cooperative, most mutually beneficial and supportive of one another, because after all, we're land mammals and we're social animals. So just that alone is a pretty significant shift. But at any rate, so back to your question, the Harvard experience as an athlete and attempting to be a good student as well had a profound impact. I ended up arguing in front of Seaver Hall in the right beside the old Harvard Yard with a much more radical upperclassmen when they were wanting to shut down the whole university. And the next thing I know, there's a CBS news camera right in my face. And I was on Walter Cronkite Evening News suggesting that we didn't need to shut down the university, that we could actually take our grievances to the Harvard Corporation as a private university, and that we'd be more effective to do that. Now, my aunt and uncle in Pennsylvania saw me on the evening news, and I think they called my parents and said, "We just saw Bud on Walter Cronkite Evening News. You might want to get him home. He might have gone off the deep end." But then that actually led to another, I mentioned and alluded to an argument. We were trying to discuss the war in Vietnam. And at that time, there were really a lot of passionate engagement, a lot of passionate engagement. And there was a woman that was, I thought she was a graduate student from Radcliffe, and they were dangerous because they were 10 times smarter than any Harvard guy would ever hope to be. And they let us know it frequently. We would get the argument settled, and then this woman would throw in like a hand grenade into the conversation, and it would all flare up again. And then she'd step back and wouldn't participate. Finally, afterwards, we got it settled, and she came over and introduced herself as Diane Dumanowski. She was an editor and producer for WGBH in Boston, and she asked me if I would participate in a 90-minute documentary called The Campus Crisis Game and simply play myself, a freshman at Harvard, moderately oriented to the whole spectrum of the issues at hand. And I was on a panel with the president for Young Americans for Freedom, Young Americans for Freedom, I think was the name. He wore a straw hat with a red, white, and blue headband and smoked a cigar and wanted to be a Major League Baseball manager and advocated putting his members, YAF, Young Americans for Freedom, that was it, on the high-rise buildings in Boston with high-powered rifles to actually shoot long-haired hippies with bell-bottom blue jeans if they were acting up. Then I had the president of the Black Panthers from Brandeis, who was the real deal, African American. So all of these kinds of experiences broadened and deepened my clarification of my position and the clarification and the deepening of my attachment to core values of generosity, kindness, compassion, and etc. I could go on with stories of that era. The weekend that I was actually there visiting as their guest, I was taken by my host to a movie at the Harvard Square Cinema. Halfway into the movie, the whole theater was evacuated from a bomb threat. We go back to Quincy House, one of the upper class houses along the Charles River, beautiful setting in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In came they were both juniors, his roommate who had grown up as an African American in Roxbury, the hardcore Black community of Boston. He was exhausted from spending the entire afternoon and evening keeping his friends all the way back to kindergarten through grade school and junior high and high school from getting on the T, the mass transit system in Boston with all their weapons, getting off in white neighborhoods and indiscriminately killing white people. So here I'm 18, having grown up in suburban Minnesota, suburban Minneapolis, finished 2 years of high school in Pacific Palisades in Southern California. And I'm in the middle, and this is just a weekend trip because I was being recruited by Brown and Harvard. And if I'd been a little brighter, I would have realized it was foreshadowing for what was going to be happening for the next 4 years because it was utter chaos during that era. Anyway, that was a much longer answer than you probably were. And have so many extraordinary experiences. And when you get to be my age, you want to share the stories because human beings talk about wellness and being. We learn profoundly the lessons that we really need to learn through story. And we don't share stories enough because of this rapid fire. We have a saying, why settle for virtual reality? Go direct. And here we are, even in virtual reality in a Zoom call, and the amount of time, screen time that people are spending now is another factor that's contributing to the predicaments that we're facing because we're separated from even human contact, much less deeper contact with the natural world. So yes. I hope that helps put a little bit of perspective into some of the things that have inspired me.
And so as a college student who stood for what was whole and right, your stories are amplifying your character and what you're holding to be true for societal change, environmental change, and planetary change.
I will share that the gifts that I've received from the relationships that I've been gifted started early on, and the quality of the professors, for example. I studied with John Kenneth Galbraith when 6 months after he published The New Industrial State. And in that book, he's a world famous economist, no longer living, of course, but The New Industrial State reminded us of President Eisenhower's admonition to beware of the military-industrial complex. And that was the first time that I actually was introduced even to that concept, as the young people may not even know that President Eisenhower was a general during World War II. And in the 1950s, he actually warned all of America at his final speech to the public that we had to beware of the military-industrial complex because we would be in perpetual warfare because of the economic incentive that has been built around that whole dynamic.
Yes.
And so that is one example of the kind of influence that was present as an impressionable young in my late teens into by the time I graduated. I made it through all 4 years.
Then you moved on to have experiences with other people that would continue to shape your life and working with John Denver. Now, I'm sure most everybody that's listening to this podcast is familiar with John Denver, very famous music artist from Colorado. And he, in his music, as well as outside of his profession, then again, stood for something greater than himself. So you went on to work closely with John Denver at Windstar Foundation. Another iconic figure in our history is Buckminster Fuller. How did those relationships influence your approach to leadership and the things that you were working on?
Thank you for again reminding me and acknowledging some of this journey. So for a decade, I was director of all the conferences and seminars in Snowmass Resort, in Snowmass Village. And I would send accompanying persons out to the Windstar Foundation to experience what they were up to as a demonstration center for how humans could actually live in balance and harmony with the natural world. But I had even met Bucky Fuller because he came to give a talk, and I met Margaret Mead that way. That was my postgraduate education, actually sitting in on so many conferences and seminars across the broad spectrum of corporations, nonprofit organizations, National Academy of Sciences, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, I just came across a recording of Margaret Mead's talk to the subcommittee of the National Academy of Sciences, Life Sciences in Space, on the topic of the colonization of the universe. So I've got to go back and listen to that one again. But what I think it provided me exposure to a whole array of brilliant people who would come into the Aspen Snowmass area, partly because of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. I was gifted with participating in some executive seminars there simply because of my role working with the Windstar Foundation as a representative from the nonprofit sector of the Roaring Fork Valley community. And that gave me even more insight into the fact that we, and especially I, would put all these people that I was meeting on a pedestal. They're way smarter than I am. They're way more accomplished and they've achieved way more than I have. And what I really discovered was through synchronicity and good fortune, luck. It's like Ansel Adams says, luck is the intersection of preparation and opportunity. When the earth turns just the right way and the light is just correct and I'm there prepared, I can get a fantastic photograph. So most of the people that I was encountering through this relationship with Windstar and working on a lot of the visionary work that Windstar was offering to the world, I realized that they're really not all that superior. They've had extraordinary, in many cases, privilege. Others were the proverbial lifting themselves up out of difficult circumstances. So that was a big aha moment to realize that we are all capable of engaging at whatever level we are passionate about, as long as we maintain a sense of curiosity and beginner's mind. And when you can encounter people that are obviously living their passion, living their purpose and their truth, ask them about it. And they might go on and on for a while with their stories, like sometimes I have a tendency to do. And yet at the same time, they are very open. This is how I met Ted Turner that way and ended up interviewing him when he came, because the work that I was offered to do at Windstar came synchronistically. I was interviewing the community school in Aspen for my son to see if we wanted to send him there for kindergarten. And then the fellow that had asked me what I was doing said I was in between a couple of projects, and he said, you should go up and talk to Windstar because they're looking for a new executive director. And that was that. And then I realized I didn't want to be the executive director because there are a lot of administrative things that weren't as interesting to me. So I worked on developing the first of a series of international symposia called Choices for the Future. And within that, because Buckminster Fuller was on our advisory board, because John Denver deeply admired Bucky Fuller and his work. And for those of you that don't know Bucky Fuller, he created something called the World Game. And it was based on a lot of data from the United Nations: food production and consumption, energy production and consumption, population distribution, blah, blah, blah. Very brilliant analysis of the state of our world, state of our planet is what we called it. He called it the World Game. And he brought design features and design characteristics into this. We have the ability to design the world we want to live in. It's all a human construct in terms of what we experience in the built environment as human beings. So we were creating a state of our planet theatrical production of Bucky Fuller's principles and data sets, because the data appealed to engineers and mathematicians, but it was abstract. It was separate from the heart-opening theatrical presentation that we converted all the data and the statistics into. And so that was one track that I was working on within the body of work that we were doing with the Choices for the Future Symposium. So we had Jean-Michel Cousteau. We offered a $10,000 award each year to the Windstar Award to one of the presenters that was living his or her life out of passion and commitment to elevating the quality of life for humans on this planet. John Denver's genuine commitment to those values and those principles, and obviously with a flair for honoring the natural world and the natural environment. So Jean-Michel Cousteau, Ted Turner, Robert Mueller of the United Nations, Rusty Schweikert, the Apollo astronaut, and on. Edgar Mitchell came the next year. And so we put these Choices for the Future symposia. You're a famous person and you get an invitation to spend 3 days in Aspen with John Denver. It's hard to turn it down. But we did it a little bit of a twist, because usually when you get a really big name to come into a conference, they show up and they leave. We required all of our presenters to sit in the front row of each and every one of the presenters that we had invited for all 3 days, and to mingle with all the participants. We attracted about 1,000 people from all over the world through our invitations to people to come. That was a very powerful exposure, again, to people doing powerful, measurable, observable, tangible work in the world across a broad spectrum of possibilities.
Wow, to the degree that you were asking them to participate, to cultivate relationships and hold space for something larger than their own agenda. Remarkable.
Exactly, because it was interdisciplinary. There was, with Rusty Schweikert, for example, he gave a beautiful talk about no frames, no boundaries. And for those that aren't familiar with NASA and its trajectory, he was the first to be a tethered spacewalker outside of the capsule with a bubble helmet. And he tells a beautiful story. In fact, I was responsible for putting together a 45-minute documentary of that program. John was a little upset with me because I spent $20,000 to produce a 45-minute documentary. And at the time, it cost about $5,000 a minute. So I was proud of myself for creating this talking heads kind of documentary that we interspersed with the highlights of all the presenters. Ram Dass was there. He was a presenter. Willis Harman, the executive director of the Noetic Sciences, came the first year. And then the second year, we had Edgar Mitchell as an astronaut, who was a lunar astronaut who founded the Noetic Sciences Institute out in Sausalito, California. So and Willis Harman isn't with us any longer either, but he wrote a beautiful book called Global Mind Change. And this was in 1986 that we were doing this work. 85, we were doing the planning, and then the first one was in June of 1986. So I alluded to Rusty Schweikert. He was outside of the capsule. So his idea of no frames, no window frames, and no boundaries was his experience when he was out with a bubble helmet and lost voice communication with the Earth. And clearly, all of a sudden, there were no window frames that he was looking through. The first time around the Earth, he was looking for all the nation states and all the boundaries. The second time around, he was taking in the continents and forgetting about all the nation state boundaries. The third time around the Earth, before the voice communication came back on, the whole planet came into his conscious awareness, floating in the blackness of space. And all of these kinds of experiences of hearing these people live and in person and getting to know them. I got to spend a little bit of time on his houseboat that he had. Rusty Schweikert had a little houseboat in Sausalito that he lived on. Maybe he liked the motion of being in a houseboat. I'm sure you don't want to hear more of these kinds of stories, but I think you're trying to get at how does all of this contribute to maintaining a focus on well-being, conscious awareness, presence, and cultivating the capacity to be present, to not shy away from these extraordinarily complex and difficult challenges. And it's interesting, I heard a comment the other day that complexity is the friend of the status quo. Naomi Oreskes wrote a book called Merchants of Doubt, because doubt is also the friend of the status quo. If you can get people to doubt whether climate change is real or not, and spend a decade or 2 decades arguing about, are we going to call it climate change or global warming? They were extraordinarily brilliantly deceitful in their work to forestall the awakening of humanity to recognize that we cannot continue these kinds of behaviors that we're so attached to because of our desire for comfort and convenience and speed. We have another saying that speed wastes time. And I don't mean to sound too admonishing, because the other ingredient that is so critical is a couple of things. John Denver used to come into the Windstar offices where we had an old 1950s ranch house that was converted to a passive active solar demonstration center. And he'd come in and say, he'd see us all distraught that we didn't have the resources to do what we wanted to do, that was the work that was available for us to do. And we were overwhelmed by all the challenges that we were facing. And he just would get a twinkle in his eye and he said, nobody ever said any of this was going to be easy. And so the idea of persevering in the face of overwhelming odds is another one of those life lessons that we either choose to embrace and accept or quickly avoid. And in the midst of a heavy duty, hardcore conversation about these things, people can watch and see, are they still present, or have they drifted thinking about what they're going to do next? And they say, see you later.
This is a perfect segue for sharing how your work evolved from being at Windstar and supporting others find a greater connection within themselves and the world around them.
It's a really good question, because what I was doing in the mountains and surrounded by the beauty of nature, I knew that if people would come and spend time in that environment, the quality of the work they were doing would be so greatly enhanced than going to a grand ballroom in a big hotel in a big city for a conference or a convention. And so that was one dimension of it. And cultivating a love for the source of our existence is so missing right now, because we are so drawn to the bright and shiny objects of technology and what's next, and we're not taking the time to experience genuine, authentic gratitude and appreciation for what nature represents as the source of our existence. Just the green people that we breathe. Without that, we couldn't even breathe. Without the plant kingdom or queendom or whatever we want to call it, right? Our plant friends, our green friends, was what Phi Beta Kappa hermit Stuart Mace, who used to live in Aspen, used to call it, our green friends. So moving into that place of clarity that we need to reconnect to the natural world, to rekindle that authentic, heart-opening experience. When most people are super stressed and you ask them, how do you get past your stress? 80%, if not 90% of those people you ask, they'll say, I take a walk in the woods. And there's Shinrin Yoku, which is the Japanese term for forest bathing. That's been increasingly recognized for all of the multidimensional qualities that are happening through pheromones of the scent that you feel and you experience, the I can see you were just taking a big
Yeah,
in
I was. I could feel
pine
it.
of the
Yes,
pine needles, or if you've never hugged a ponderosa pine, you'll
I
get
have.
a little butterscotch vanilla scent that comes and fills all of your being. So just that alone gives me goosebumps to think about how powerful just that connection is. If we shift a radical perception from what's nature going to give me? What can I take away? Those of you that are familiar with Ishmael, for example, communicating with a gorilla, and the gorilla said, the sooner humans stop taking everything, the taker mentality, the better off the world will be. So it's not that difficult to notice, oh yeah, I did go in with an expectation that I was going to take something away with me. And you just turn that around 180 degrees and give back your love, gratitude, and appreciation. Nature begins to show up in a profoundly different manner because it's surprised to actually see a human being embody that kind of energy and that kind of quality. For me, I went through some very dramatic trauma and drama in my life. And about at that time, I was being introduced to a fellow because I was two things. I had been asked to be a member of the Aspen Rotary Club. And after spending 8 years, I was about ready to think maybe this isn't exactly my tribe. And then I noticed that there was a Preserve Planet Earth campaign brochure that the Rotary International president had initiated 2 years earlier, and I hadn't even heard about it through the network of Rotary. He was an industrialist in Sao Paulo, Brazil. His family members were dying from pollution from the intensity of a massive city in South America. And so he decided, as in his position as the international president of Rotary, with 1.5 million members in 110 countries or some such thing, maybe 120, he saw he had a huge network all of a sudden. And so he launched this Preserve Planet Earth campaign. I saw that, and with my experience at Windstar, I decided, okay, I'll create a little educational training program, and I called it Eco Action. And as I was sharing with you earlier, that was a big mistake because back then, eco sounded like terrorism to a well-respected businessman, and action suggested that they might actually have to do something instead of throw a bunch of money at cleaning up a local park and putting a Rotary plaque on a tree. Now, I'm undervaluing the tremendous contributions that Rotary makes in all the communities all around the world where they have their Rotary clubs. But so for the drama of exaggerating, I decided that I would design a program to bring a Rotarian, a business person that had business acumen and the financial resources that could support a project through Rotary, and then students and either a teacher and an administrator as a team from all the different communities. You drive through the countryside, every small town usually has a plaque outside that's got a Rotary symbol on it. So there are Rotary clubs all over the place. And so we invited a group to actually to the Windstar property, 1,000 acres in Old Snowmass outside of Aspen. And that was a beginning of seeing what we could do to inspire the youthful passion with a little more experienced leadership capacity from the adults and the Rotary Club, and then implement a project that had measurable and observable impact in the community, addressing an issue that was based on an analysis or a walkabout, recognizing what were the deep ecological principles and practices that were not being embodied that needed to be incorporated into a project. And so that was the beginning. And then I realized also that my time with John Milton, who created Sacred Passage program and the Way of Nature program, that I was going to take my advisory board from the Rotary group and my Eco Action project to do a Sacred Passage on the Baja Peninsula of Mexico. It was such a deep dive for 6 nights and 7 days of alone time with no reading, no writing, no fire, no distractions. you and yourself and nature. The earth literally breathed me during that solo time. And I had many other encounters with the unseen realms and the spirit realm. And by the way, people might say, oh, yeah, you were on an ayahuasca journey or whatever. Zero plant medicine. Our personal design, our biological design is such that is not necessary nor is it required to be able to access the spirit realms. And when you go in with a genuine open heart and you quiet your mind and you surrender and come in with beginner's mind and an attitude of not knowing, the whole display arises and dissolves. The 10,000 things, as the Taoists suggest. And there's even a gesture in Taoism where they gesture to the forehead and they say body, speech, and a gesture to the heart, mind. And now it's heart, mind. So that all gets activated in nature. And the experience that I had then put me on a 35-year journey of studying and apprenticing and becoming a nature guide. Part of my preparation was a 49-day training, then followed by a 28-day solo in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of southern Colorado to honor the divine feminine principle and the full lunar cycle. So that was an intermediate level of training to be able to be competent to meet people where they are, because it's not easy. And then that was followed, and I mentioned the other day to you, the 108-day journey through Nepal, Thailand, and Indonesia, visiting sacred sites, going into ancient sacred caves, receiving teachings and training from the Advaita Vedanta non-dual Hindu path, the Dzogchen Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhist path, the mixture in Indonesia of Buddhism and Hinduism and animism. All of these were part of our process in the flow. And that was preparation to come back into the United States to do a 40-day solo in the Cochise stronghold of the desert mountains of Arizona. And again, that was to honor more of the masculine, but also the full-on classical Native American style vision quest of no food, no water, no sleep, no clothes, no shelter for 3 nights and 4 days. But that is not recommended until you have had a lot of preparation, and it's not necessary either. But given the classical style of teaching that my mentor, now friend and colleague, was offering, it was part of being able to have the kinds of experiences that people that would come to do a program might encounter and they might have. Because while I did take some psychology courses, undergraduate courses, I'm not a psychologist, but I have had enough now experience to know what human beings can go through when they're either in fear, terror, boredom, what have you. We make a recommendation on arriving to make a full-on commitment, 100% commitment to personal liberation in this lifetime. And we simply recommend that they also embrace the interdependent interconnectedness of all that is in the seen and the unseen realms, and then recognize that it is constantly changing. So all of those kinds of ideas can be very intimidating for people that have been conditioned in our Western rational culture.
If you could share outcomes.
Sure. I think the simplest way to put this is that as a CEO or a senior executive in a corporate structure and trying to sort through the corporate culture, self-inquiry, introspection provides tremendous value to being an effective servant leader. And even the notion of being a servant leader is a stretch for a lot of corporations and companies. So there's that as step one. Step two is that when you do surrender and come in with beginner's mind, nature provides what we call an earth empowerment. We give people some contemplative practices and some Qigong instruction, which is a martial art form, but it's actually cultivating universal energy and learning how to then become more energized and more it enhances vitality. It enhances health, overall wellness and health. And so we give some of those grounding exercises and energy cultivation exercises. And when you're present doing, let's say, an 11 direction ceremony, and you're giving back your love, gratitude, and appreciation with it, even if it's just an offering from your heart or something that's relevant to the bioregion within which you are doing your program, that opens up a whole nother pathway. And everyone that, without exception, that over the years, 35 years of this kind of work, always comes away with greater creativity, greater insight, compassion for self and others, and an earth empowerment. And when that earth empowerment is transmitted, no further future decisions can be made by that individual without authentically and genuinely considering, in the native context, the impact of those choices and decisions on the seventh generation removed. So it sounds perhaps a little too much to believe or even accept, but I can assure you that if you come in with a genuine beginner's mind and an open heart and surrender your mobile devices at the door and the threshold that you step across to go into pristine wilderness and nature, it is astonishing. I'll never forget, after my first program, I went back to Snowmass Village, where I had a previous identity as director of all these conferences and seminars. And somebody in the steam room at the Snowmass Club just said, "Bud, what in the heck are you doing and why?" And I paused for a moment. I wanted to know, what was he really asking? And I think he was really asking, what would he experience if he did what I did? But the answer that I gave him was, all I can say right now is that there is so much more happening in every nanosecond than we have been conditioned to even believe or imagine possible, that I've stepped across a threshold and I'm in complete awe and wonderment of the vast mystery. And I think that sank in. He didn't say, "Oh, okay, well, see you later." He wanted me to give him a little bit more. Yeah, so I think that again, even the mentality of what is my takeaway, even that goes against the essence and the depth of what's being offered. To measure what's the takeaway is on a superficial level, because the transformational experience at the cellular level of your being is profound. And I've observed this over and over again. So I would just say that leave all expectations behind, and the value and the power of commitment is extraordinary. Intention guides the chi, energy follows thought. And when you put those principles into action and you surrender any expectation for what might arise, that's part of the magic and the mystery. And this morning I was sharing something from another organizational development person. We find joy in what we attempted, not in what we accomplished. So just that shift in energetic expectation is beneficial.
Thank you for sharing that. What's landing for me is when we look at outcomes, they're so unique anyway, right? We have universal principles and nature serving everything up when we open ourselves to say yes to an opportunity. And so only the mind is the vehicle in which we create those expectations. But it's the body, mind, spirit that's open to it all, much as you were when the earth breathed you. And I've had that experience in Bali before. It's so profound that whatever outcomes were perceived, it blows them out of the water anyway. They're indescribable. And so that transference of energy from earth into self, you contributed as much as you gained. And then you get to walk away and bring that into the next conversation, into the next decision, into the next experience. And that's the presencing, because you've had an experience of it one time.
And speaking of presencing and the Presencing Institute, both Peter Senge and Joe Jaworski and Otto Scharmer, the people that have been associated with the Presencing Institute, they all went through this process with my mentor and friend and colleague now. And they continue to actually renew their commitment to studying and continually going deeper and deeper. Resting at the bottom of the U was the 12th principle of the process that they were offered back through the way of nature and in the deep nature journey context. But what's also key is that the experiences continually unfold for years, if not decades, and those encounters, we call them close totemic encounters with your totem spirit beings or animals, whatever might come to you in a way that is so unusual and not predictable that they come back and then they're deepened. So I used to say this goes so much beyond the stereotypical weekend warrior workshop in a grand ballroom at a big hotel. You gain from those kinds of experiences, but nothing like the deepest immersion in the natural world, which I know you offer with many of your programs. It's a world of difference, and actually I've been talking a lot, sharing a lot of story, but what I will assure people is that I get completely out of the way after I'm certain that people have enough guidance with practices and things that can keep them engaged. We recommend they make friends with boredom because that will happen. But nature becomes the most spectacular teacher when we allow nature to be in its fullest expression.
Yes, I love that. And now everyone knows who to go to when they're ready for their deep nature journey.
And I'm happy to do this with one or two or three people, a family. I've done this with families.
Oh,
You can pick a custom time because I've been
great
involved
to
in
know.
a lot of other leadership projects right now, and not I haven't had the time. Maybe you and I should combine our background and make an offering. I do a lot of the work over in the Canyonlands. We've scouted out some pretty spectacular, wonderful places there. So I'm flexible, in other words, to be available because that's the vow of being part of this process and a promise that I've made to source and to nature.
Oh, that's extraordinary. I'll be putting the link to your website so they can learn more, and to a couple YouTube videos that explain just the multidimensional value when one seeks this for themselves or within a family and or with an executive team.
Yeah, we can even
Pressurized. Yeah.
an afternoon, 2 or 3 hours of a little mini solo. I was a participating professional in the Outward Bound program, and you can just go out for an hour or two
Okay.
yourself and contemplate what's possible.
Excellent. Excellent, Bud. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show. And I stand with you in all that you do, and the impact that this, even though we were mentioning technology, that is the beauty, that these stories will live on and they'll transmit to whomever is ready and excited to take the next step.
Yes, synchronicity is the language of the sacred. And I promised also that I would share something that Jean-Michel Cousteau offered at one of our Choices Symposia 35 years ago. He said, people protect what they love. And we need to have people loving the earth, caring for the earth, loving oneself, loving others, and reconnect through community, because more often than not, community is the answer to all the challenges that we're facing. And people protect what they love, and it's time to fall in love again with our source of existence.
That is a beautiful way to end the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure, and thanks for all those out there listening.
Are you enjoying the Discover Wellbeing podcast? If so, I would love to hear about it. Leaving a review helps more people find us and really makes a difference. So share your thoughts on Apple Podcast or your favorite platform.